We are indeed honoured and privileged to welcome as our last Ramsay speaker for this year, a most distinguished guest, only able to join us at all because he has recently stepped down as Governor, the 33rd Governor of Western Australia. I'm sure I hardly need to remind most of you, the Honourable Kim Beazley AC has had a truly extraordinary public career, and in the couple of minutes I've got now I can only give you the abbreviated version, the expurgated version. Born into a political family in Perth, Kim Beazley Jr., and many of us will remember Kim Beazley Sr., also a very distinguished parliamentarian. Kim was the Rhodes Scholar for Western Australia in 1973 when he went to study for an MPhil at Oxford. Balliol, I believe, Kim. Nobody's perfect. I was at Magdalen, sorry, couldn't resist. He then, when returning from Oxford, he became a tutor in politics at Murdoch University, and he has retained his academic profile as well as the political one all his life. And then beginning in 1980, Mr. Beazley spent close to 30 years in the federal parliament and still says that's the experience that he misses most, representing the electorates of Brand and Swan. He held major portfolios in both the Hawke and Keating Labor governments, notably defence, finance, employment, education and training, and aviation. And of course, he was leader of the Australian Labor Party and leader of the opposition from 1996 to 2001, and again from 2005 to 2006, the only one who's done that twice. He was leader of the House from 1988 to 96, and Deputy Prime Minister from 1995 to 96. Mr. Beazley also served on many parliamentary committees, notably the JIC, the Joint Intelligence Committee, and the Committee for Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. And then after his retirement from politics in 2007, Kim Beazley was appointed Winthrop Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Western Australia. And then the very next year, Professor Beazley was then appointed Chancellor of the ANU, only stepping down from that role to take up his appointment as Ambassador to the United States of America in February 2010, in which role he served with great distinction for nearly 6 years. And since then, Professor Ambassador Beazley has been President of the Australian Institute for International Affairs, co-chairman of the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, distinguished fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and a director and distinguished fellow at the Perth US Asia Centre. In 2009, he was awarded the Companion of the Order of Australia for service to the Parliament in relation to defence and international relations, and as an advocate for Indigenous people. And I should just add as a coda, forgive me, perhaps the most important of all his roles, Kim Beazley was a member of the board of the Ramsay Centre from 2017 through till his appointment as Governor, when our chairman reluctantly had to let him go. So, enough from me. The format this evening is very simple. Mr. Beazley will speak for, well, as long as he likes. As long as he likes. And then we will go straight to questions from the floor. So the topic for this final Ramsay Lecture for the year, and no one in the country better qualified and equipped to talk about this, Australian Self-Reliance, the task for our defence review. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kim Beazley.
Thanks very much, Simon. Well, thank you very much, Simon, and it's a real privilege and pleasure to be here under the aegis of the Ramsay Centre. My short time on the board, I loved. There was great companions and great discussions. I am classically illiterate, so there was not much I could contribute, but nevertheless, it was pure pleasure being with you all. I should also acknowledge the Prime Minister, who is here and continuing his role with the Centre and which he has been its very distinguished leader. Can I also acknowledge the Gadigal people, who are the traditional owners of the area covered by the City of Sydney, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I do that because when I was governor, I would respond to welcomes for country with recognition of traditional owners probably at least a dozen times a week. So I got very, very used to it. It also dovetailed with what used to be a question I asked myself when I was Defence Minister way back when, and I've really asked it the entire time I've been in politics, and that is the question, what right have we got to be here? Now I'm not making a political point with that. I'm making an analytical point when I ask that question, what right have we got to be here? We're a product of force majeure. In the case of the eastern states, we're a product of a colonial loss by Britain when they found themselves in a situation where they needed to replace the prison hulks in the waters around Georgia with somewhere else to send their prisoners. That created us here in the first instance. In Western Australia, we were a product of the British victory at Trafalgar. Because the British victory at Trafalgar established British sea power for the rest of the 19th century. So when the French claimed Western Australia first, and if there was any legitimacy in our claim, there was legitimacy in theirs, the British gazumped it and came out and declared themselves the owners of the West Australian area. So in those two acts, we supplanted with our colonies then, and ultimately our nation, 250 nations that at that point of time inhabited Australia. Got to remember, we have a right to exist via various determinations made in the aftermath of World War II and the creation of the United Nations and a whole series of national rights. But frankly, when force majeure you're capable of exercising it and you need something else, generally speaking, over the millennia, societies have chosen to exercise it. So what right have we got to be here? The right we've got to be here is what we establish for ourselves. What we establish for ourselves in our capacity to defend ourselves. And if we do not have the capacity to defend ourselves, the way the drift of power is going in the region which we inhabit is decisively against us. And we will need to be even more effective than we've ever been before. There's one thing I liked about the Soviets, and that was their analysis of the way in which global politics moved. As a Westerner, I was devoted to the idea of the balance of power, and if you got brought up in the British academic tradition, which I was, the balance of power and Britain being a balancer was always a factor in the way in which they analysed the world. The Soviets used to talk about the correlation of forces. And the correlation of forces was not a static piece of analysis, it was fluid. And it incorporated within its analysis a whole variety of factors, not simply just military and economic, important though they were, but psychological, legal, ideological, capacities, or grey zone now we'd call it, but back then, the capacity to influence events around you and in a way that you would exercise quite fearlessly a diminution of the authority of nations which perhaps stood in your way. That, analysing things that way, you get a pretty clear understanding of where you stand and what your survival prospects are. So John Howard would be one of the most optimistic politicians I've ever known. Very good, and he's my nemesis. But I have always been the most pessimistic of politicians. And that is not necessarily a good thing, but that's what I am. So when I sit down to talk about self-reliance on defence, understand that that's my approach, and that generally speaking, I'm quite frightened. And generally speaking, I have always been. Now, our current Defence Minister, who's the only man in political life these days I truly envy, he gave this analysis of what he expected to emerge from the processes that he's put in place in studying our defence needs. And he said this to the Sydney Institute a fortnight ago. Australia's defence capabilities cannot meet those of major powers. Australian statecraft is only viable if it is underpinned by the ability to project force and power. To deter military threats and defend Australia's national interests within our immediate region. And so I believe the cornerstone of future Australian strategic thought will be impactful projection. We must invest in targeted capabilities that enable us to hold potential adversaries at risk at a distance and increase the calculated cost of aggression against Australia and its interests. And we must be able to do this through the full spectrum of proportionate response. Now those two paragraphs fascinated me. It was a good speech through the rest of it. That is a revolution in Australian defence calculation. It's never been presented as such, but the idea of projection in the area that we have to be able to project into, in my day as we restructured Australian defence planning, was not the area of direct military interest on which we calculated force structure, but the area of direct strategic interest on which we calculate force structure. And can I say this, and I might get a chance to talk about it a bit more a bit later on, that almost nothing in the Australian Defence Forces that we have at this moment actually delivers that. Almost nothing. That's basically missiles. That is, but long-distance missiles. Missiles delivered by air. We have the capability, or the platforms in the C-130s, the Poseidons, and probably the Super Hornets. From the ground, we don't have that, but that's the HIMARS missile system, which has been made famous in Ukraine of recent days, and it has a variant, which is a long-distance variant not being used in Ukraine at the moment, but would be placed on mobile army platforms. And of course we have the sea. We have the air warfare destroyer, which does carry missiles, but mainly anti-air missiles. And we have submarines capable of carrying Tomahawk missiles, and I suspect and hope that when the push comes to shove, they'll be planning to introduce those into the submarine force. But these missiles we do not have, and these missiles are in great demand. We're working on an Australian version, courtesy of Lockheed and Raytheon, who are trying to design jointly a missile that will be a special missile for us. But designing missiles is very hard, because you've got to design them to actually hit the target. And when you think of the distances over which you're firing, that is no mean achievement to be able to do that, and we have not done it yet. And that is going to be a very substantial challenge for the Defence Forces. In terms of the emergence of capabilities in the region around us, correlation of forces, I would argue that we are in the toughest position that we have ever been, and it's not going to get easier. Japan in the 1930s, when already Australian politicians were beginning to ask questions about whether or not the situation would be such that the British would come to our assistance. But recollect that at that point of time, when we were beginning to be fearful of that prospect, there were 3 European empires and 1 American empire between us and the Japanese. The Japanese were in China, which was effectively beginning to tie down 2 million Japanese troops. Unbeknownst to us in 1942, when we felt ourselves to be at extremity and in our definition of living dangerously, the Japanese Army and Navy conducted a debate on whether or not, in February of 1942, a couple of months after Pearl Harbor, whether or not to invade Australia. The Navy was very keen. The Army came to a different view. The Army said it'd be tremendously demanding on transports and on personnel. Australian troops have a quality that means a defeat at some point in the incursion would be highly likely, and that it would be for the Japanese Army an unsustainable waste of time. What they said to the Navy was, what you have to do is to cut Australia off from the United States. So you should take New Guinea and move through the islands, and you will effectively be able to do that. And that was their task. That was a task blocked by us in Papua and by the Americans in Guadalcanal. That fell apart pretty quickly after the objective was, well, within a year after that objective was set. But even with all of that, I would argue, and I'll make a point or two about it, that we're not then in as difficult a situation as we are now. China has some independent states between them and us, and some have got substantial capabilities, like the Vietnamese and the Indonesians. But they have an objective, which is a perfectly respectable one, for a nation of their power to dominate the two island chains, for the inner island chain, outer island chain, as the areas from which they're most likely to be threatened. Of course, included within that is Taiwan. Included within the second island chain is Japan. And it doesn't quite touch us, the second island chain, but it touches an awful lot of our friends. Chinese Navy is bigger than the Americans, on the way to being much bigger than the Americans. It's not qualitatively as good as the Americans, but conceivably that is only a matter of time. And so we have a situation where we have to be very careful in the way in which we spend our money, and above all in the way in which we maintain our alliances. Still, and we're always guilty of putting great capabilities on those whom we fear, or those who are competitors, or maybe problems for us. And you do need to understand that we have problems, they have problems. I have a friend, actually his cousin by marriage, who's very wealthy. At the beginning of this year, he said to me, I am selling every share I have in companies with exposure to China, every share. I said, Baz, why are you doing that? He said, well, several things. Firstly, he said, it's not just a company or two in the Chinese real estate development part of the economy that are bankrupt. All of it is bankrupt, the whole lot. That was his analysis of what we're confronting. And that's 32% of the Chinese economy. And then he said, the vaccine that they have, the Sinovac, does not work in dealing with the contemporary versions of COVID. And the pride does not permit them to import, and even so now it would be enormously difficult to get the numbers of vaccines that you'd actually need for the Chinese population. Doesn't permit them to do that. They have only one mechanism of dealing with it, because they do not want to see large deaths in their population, and that is to shut down. And that is going to create a rolling economic crisis, building on the other economic crisis to which I revert. And then they have demographic issues. Now, he wasn't quite as au fait with these as other people are, but I understand that roughly the gender proportions between male and female in China is 125 men to 100 women. Now, generally in this country, it's 103 women to 100 men. In most countries, it's 101 to 100 men. That is a massive crisis in their situation. Now, there's a chap who is an acquaintance of the bloke who heads up the US Asia Centre in Western Australia, a fellow named Yi Vuxian. Now, he is well into his 80s. He's in Wisconsin at the university now, senior scientist in obstetrics and gynecology. But before he came to America, he was effectively a demographer in China. And he has his own analysis. Now, I can't verify any of this, obviously, but it's worth looking at what his analysis was. Now, it includes this calculation. The Chinese population, he says, is 100 million less than the official statistic. And it has, as we already said, a massive overpreponderance of men. Every 100 pregnancies in China are ended by, every 100 pregnancies are ended in 43 cases by abortions. Now, that compares with the figure in Japan, 15. In Taiwan, 13. In the US, 19. And the infertility rate amongst women, which is normally about 3 or 4%, in China is now, it's now 20%. Now, this is a really serious demographic situation. He also maintains China's replacement rate is allegedly between about 1.3 and 1.6. I think we're at about 1.7. And at the minimum level, the Chinese would admit to 1.3. He says, no, it's this bloke, it's 0.8. Now, 0.8 is called a cliff. And that is, if that is true, then there's a very serious problem now confronting the Chinese, and they can't get around it. For a long time now, they've allowed 2 and recently 3 children per family. Chinese women are not responding. That's all there is to it. So there's going to be a substantial issue for China in the demographic area long term. Does that make them any less or more of a problem in confronting other powers or reclaiming Taiwan for themselves? No, not necessarily at all. But what it may affect is the timetable. So that's a situation which we have to think about it. And then we've got the United States, our ally. Now, they're immensely more powerful now than they were before World War II. And then, of course, the fact that they were attacked by the Japanese, an extraordinarily foolish measure. They basically, when they did it, ended the war in both Europe and in the Pacific, because their engagement meant their enemies were dead. And they have since then have been the deliverers of the most unselfish act in human history, Hegelian in its dimensions. After having been an isolationist country, they enter the nuclear era. And they say that they will defend their friends and allies and extend to them a nuclear umbrella. In other words, to the places which had been the mad causes of war for centuries, Europe and North Asia, they said to the Europeans, we trust you enough not to see all of us killed. Because if that had ever been called upon, and the Americans would have responded, 100 million Americans would have died. Now that is, I still find it mind-boggling to contemplate that a society would ever do that, would ever be prepared to put themselves on the line for a whole raft of other societies, and particularly other societies with a level of responsibility exercised by Europeans and North Asians over the previous part of the century. But they did. Now they are beginning to feel it. They know, overstretched. They have basically had to come back to Europe, and the whole point of the pivot was not to have to do that, but they have to do that. And they have the issues here in the Indo-Pacific. When I was ambassador, if any of us ever said that the United States did not have preeminence in the Northern Pacific, we'd get our backsides kicked. There are one or two Australian ministers who did, but generally speaking, it was me who got it, and not them. Whenever they came through, they were perfect politeness. They said, "Why don't you talk to them like you do to me?" And they said, "Well, they're ministers and you're not." So that was always interesting to me. But now they don't talk like that anymore. They don't talk about preeminence. Our ministers who sit down with them don't hear the American statesmen say that. They talk a lot about allies. They talk a lot about leveraging their allies. So it's very important for us to remember that as we go about calculating defending ourselves. Now, our problem is going to be in this review is going to be resources. There's lots of other things that are going to be problems. You have to work out what sort of force structure you want. But at the end of the day, you actually have to be able to buy them, produce them. We were brilliant in World War II. We were the most mobilised belligerent of allies and enemies in World War II. Women were civilly conscripted. Married women got monstered to be, in the wonderful phrase of the day, man-powered. And they were absolutely essential. Curtin, in his first address to the Americans, pointed out how serious they were, how serious we were, because we were mobilising all our women. And in 1944, we had to abandon a division. And MacArthur was beside himself with fury. And the British Imperial General Staff rang up MacArthur and said, "Listen, they are feeding us and they are supplying you, and they have run out of women." So that was an interesting thing for MacArthur to have to contemplate. We just were extraordinary. In 42-43, our year of living dangerously, defence expenditure rose to 34% of GDP. It's now 27%. And 70% of the budget was spent on defence. Truman, at the end of the war in 1946, reporting to Congress on the Lend-Lease program, came to us and said, "This is amazing. Think of that little country, Australia, only 7 million people. They and we spent the same amount." Truman was wrong. The Americans owed us money when the war was over under the Lend-Lease program. As we had kept MacArthur's army going, there was a simple reason for that. He was absolutely hated in Washington. And while he's a good general, he wasn't a good friend of the folk in power in Washington. And we had to hold him up. Not until 1944 did MacArthur have more American servicemen under his control than Australian. We made the bloke. And our performance, and the performance of Australian industry, was truly magnificent. If you want to find a hero of World War II that isn't mentioned often, it's a bloke named Essington Lewis. Now, Essington Lewis was head of BHP. He went and toured Japan, he came back and he said, "Oh, are we in trouble?" And what BHP then did was stockpile tons and tons and tons of iron ore and steel. You'd never get away with it with a board these days. But then he did. And thank God, because that provided everything for our defence industries during the course of the war. And we built, in 1 year, I think it was 42, could have been 43, we built 28 corvettes alone. You imagine that as a shipbuilding program these days. But that performance by us is actually impossible now. It's impossible now partly as a result of how successful it was, because it changed expectations of the federal government. So that wartime centralisation of tax and the superb federal performance meant that most of the functions that had previously been the sole responsibility of the states became federal responsibilities. Now, I used to be nagged by the Americans to get to 2% of GDP, a figure we've just hit. And I used to point out to the Americans this: then we had 25% of GDP in the federal public sector. Now it's 27, courtesy of COVID. But on top of that, we had 11% of GDP at the state level. The Americans had 25% of GDP at federal level, and as well as that, 13 at the state level. They are actually publicly spending more in terms of percentage of GDP than we were back at the time that I was ambassador. And I used to point out to them these things, that we did do the same amount of GDP, and with their share they did defence, what they call social security, but we'd call pensions, Medicare, Medicaid. The rest is spent on things like infrastructure, unemployment, housing, etc., but leveraging the states and private sector. For example, on unemployment benefits, you get them for 12 months in the United States, and half of them are provided by the states, and anything further than 12 months is exclusively provided by the states. What do we do with our 25? Well, we did universal health care, we did pensions, we did all unemployment benefits, we did universities, we did 35% of the kids in private education, and substantial amounts of money for state education. We had an array of social spending, supporting parents' benefits, childcare, funds for at-risk students, to which you can now add newly, but wasn't in existence then, disability insurance. And disability insurance in the last budget, or last Liberal budget, I'm not sure what it was but I think it's the same, surpassed defence spending. We spend more on the position of disability insurees than we do for our defence forces. We obviously can't get anywhere near our performance of World War II. But what worries me is we are nowhere near what we actually managed to get to in the 1980s. When I was Minister for Defence, defence spending was around 2.5% and 8 to 9% of the budget. We've now just hit 2%. For the last 25 years, we're below that. And we're at about 6% of the budget. Well, what went wrong? What I failed to do when I was Defence Minister was to convince the Australian public that the defence budget had nothing to do with the Cold War. Nothing at all. We made a substantial contribution. We made it through the joint facilities. We permitted, or did, most of the surveillance of the Soviet Union's operation at Cam Ranh Bay. We told the Americans that Army, Navy, Air Force had within them elements. Even though they were designed for our defence, they had within them elements, if a problem went wrong, something went wrong, we could commit elements of the forces that we had for our own defence to their activities somewhere else. And we could do it quite heavily, actually. John Howard did it in Timor. We had a capacity without planning or focusing our planning on what we do to assist an ally, to nevertheless assist allies and do substantial things in the region. Because certainly Timor was in our region of direct military interest, as well as direct strategic interest. So we had a disciplined approach. We started by asking the question, what is our general strategy? What is the threat that we're meant to meet? Well, our general strategy was self-reliance. The threat that we had to meet with the force was what we called escalated low-level threats. All we faced were actually low-level threats. We went above it, but the ships, the army, the aircraft, the submarines, they're all aimed at defending ourselves. And we fitted everything into it. I remember with the Navy in particular, we planned for 17 warships, 9 Tier 1 we call, which were the DDGs and the FFGs, and 8 Tier 2, which were the Anzacs. Our plan was 17 ships. We were 4 ships short. And we thought the New Zealanders might provide those 4 ships to us if they bought the same frigate that we were buying. You know, it's always triumph of hope. And but that was it. That's what we figured we needed. Why did we think that? The same thing as I failed to get 8 submarines, which is what I'd asked for. I only got 6. It all relates to the choke points of entry into Australian home waters. And there's 4 of them through the archipelago. So we needed to be able to put those sorts of ships and submarines in that area permanently if a conflict were to ensue. We never got anywhere near the 17. Nowhere near it. And of the Tier 1 ships, we now have 3. You know, and that's the air warfare destroyer. We didn't get that until quite recently. So that was part of what went wrong. And you can go through all the services and see that. Everybody else took, at the end of the Cold War, a dividend, a peace dividend. Unfortunately, so did we, even though our planning had nothing to do with the Cold War. It was placed on, as I said, that defence self-reliance, but it was also combined with figures for early warning. Now, this has disappeared from defence entirely. They don't look at early warning at all. We're thankful because there isn't any anymore. So, but then we did. And Paul Dibb used to have this whiteboard up. I said they'd sit down, and the defence is essentially theological. They would sit down and try to work out how you measured changes in the character of the threat. And they're all semi-mathematical as they went through all these exercises to work that sort of thing out. We also had a military strategy. The military strategy was layered defence, so that you'd see us becoming almost impossible at the last layer in regard to that. It's not how we looked at subsequent white papers, not at all. We didn't have that Cold War sense. I think the thing was this, that even though it was not based on the Cold War, we had a Cold War way of thinking. And the Cold War elevated the defence role to very high levels. And and it's not just us, but right through the democratic world, it drove an idea that defence was not your top priority, it was close to it. And Marcus Hellier, who's peerless, and he produces every year for ASPI a book called The Cost of Defence. He is the only person who knows what we actually spend on defence. As for the time when I was minister, you never really knew. You never really knew what we spent. It's sort of mildly chaotic and very, very complex. But Marcus has, and I asked Marcus if he'd do a calculation for me if we'd sustained the 1980s levels of GDP and budget. And he said, well, it depends how you do the calculation, but it's somewhere between 8 billion and 18 billion. Now that's per annum, not between 8 billion and 18 billion for 25 years, but between 8 billion and 18 billion per annum. we would look nothing like we are now. Nothing. If we'd been, just take the lesser figure, if we'd been doing $8 billion a year more on defence. So that's where we are. And this government has said that we'll increase defence spending. And the Minister's strategy, I said, is to establish the deterrence at a long range. And even more difficult for Smith and Houston is that they have to produce answers which leave us in a defensible position within 3 years. So the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance program study that's going through at the moment with Lockheed and Raytheon, that's part of it. The Army HIMARS and longer range elements, that's land-based, and becoming important in their calculation is our chain of air bases, which we don't focus on as a change, but they stretch from Cocos Islands through to Sherga in Queensland. And that is really the point from which any war we fight would be fought. And of course we have in the air warfare destroyer and the submarines magnificent platforms, but not many of them, 3 of the one and 6 of the other. And we just have to start, and there's one thing which they're not focusing on, which I think they should, and that's mining and counter-mining. It's a lot easier to do things underwater than to send your planes or even your missiles these days with missile defences, even your missiles against your enemies, but if you're underneath them, they've got no chance. So that I hope that they will incorporate within the way in which they're thinking of things. And the AUKUS technologies, well, that'll assist over time, but they also have to get other departments involved. Fuel stocks is not the responsibility of the Department of Defence, it's the responsibility of the Department of Energy. But we have fuel stocks, I think, that would get us through a couple of weeks. But after that, serious trouble. And there is no substitute for this, let me tell you. There is no substitute. You've got to dig really big holes in Western Australia and Victoria, Queensland and New South Wales, really big holes, and fill them full of crude oil. Because you cannot keep processed oil for longer than 6 months. So refined oil is no point storing that. You actually have to build the refineries, in other words, reopen the one in Western Australia and add the 2 that were shut recently in the eastern states to ensure that we can actually do something about that so we can all drive our cars if a fight breaks out. Because right now, if I was the Prime Minister of this country, I'd say nobody drives. If a major league conflict actually broke out. We don't have to be in that position, but we are. Now, there's one other thing, and I'm going to go what's seemingly right off the point here, because there's one thing that Australia is uniquely positioned to do, and if we do it, and we are helped by the Americans and the Brits under AUKUS to do it, we will save the alliance. We will save the West. We have ignored all these years the problem of complete Chinese control of rare earth production. And not just the digging it up, but the processing. We have the biggest rare earth mine in the world. Lynas owns it. Meekatharra, West Australia. It's now starting to do local production, local processing. Currently does it in Malaysia, but it's not popular in Malaysia. Needs to be done. They're going to replicate that here in Kalgoorlie. And the previous federal government gave another of the rare earth producers in WA, Iluka, about a loan of about 1.2 billion to get their processing going in Kwinana. We have operating either in full phase or pilot phase about 5 rare earth mines, and we've identified at least 2 or 3 others as possibilities. We can supplant, if they're dug up and processed here, we can probably supplant the current level of dependence on China of the Americans. 3,240 American weapons systems have rare earths in them. Joe Hockey, my successor in America, quote, "In terms of critical minerals, my concern is, and there have started to be a few reports in the US suggesting this, is that after the US midterm elections and with a re-empowered Xi, as of next year, China will start to turn down the tap on the supply of critical minerals to the US and other places. Now, if they even start to adjust the tap, the US is going to go nuts." That's what Joe said. I haven't often agreed with Joe in my life. I think he's probably right. And that is a problem which we can absolutely solve. Absolutely. We are part of the American National Technological Base, so they can help us solve it, or for themselves. But the problem is that, and I was pleased to see the Treasurer Jim Chalmers say the other day that we've got to be involved with critical minerals. This is the bad news. There is absolutely no chance whatsoever that the free market will allow that to happen. None whatsoever. And anybody who thinks it can is kidding themselves and endangering our society. The simple fact of the matter is the Chinese make adjustments on the prices. Some 400 efforts have been put in place in the last decade or so to have something like that process going. Only one has succeeded, though it's been under constant attack, and that is Lynas in Western Australia, saved regularly by the Japanese. Whenever the Chinese try to wipe out Lynas, and they do that every now and then, the Japanese step in and they get the stuff. They buy the stuff and make sure it's processed. That doesn't go through China. President Biden was very proud to answer, to open, or not open, but provide resources to reopen another big mine. That is at Mountain Pass, which had previously been a mine, taken over by the Chinese, shut down, now reopened. And in the meetings that he's had on critical minerals, he's always referred to how good this is. It is a big mine, probably second only to Lynas's mine. But 100% of the offtake goes to China to be processed. So there is it is a decision that has to be taken. And that's why I want Essington Lewis's spirit to come back and inject us all, empower us all as we consider this issue. He did not worry about the cost to BHP of all the iron ore that he was storing and the steel that he was storing. Couldn't give a damn. He thought that if he didn't, his country would disappear. Now, if we don't get this thing resolved, that might happen 80 years later. So it's a challenge for us, it's a challenge for AUKUS. So if AUKUS gets to mean anything, and it should, but it's not an alliance, or it's an agreement really to mutual development. Good thing, but it's not a big thing. But if it did this, not only be a good thing, it'd be a big thing. So as we contemplate defence, that's something that won't be in Smith and Houston's report. Won't be in anything, I don't think, that the Defence Minister says, but by crikey, if it doesn't happen, we're in trouble. Yeah.
Well, you've
Oh, no. I think we'll be all right.
Is he audible?
Yes, it's fine.
It's fine, okay.
Right.
Well, Mr. Beazley's given us an enormous amount to think about, and he's very generously said he's prepared to take any questions from anybody. So on his behalf, can I just say, please identify yourself before asking your question. Please try to keep the question reasonably short and to the point, and please try to make it a question, not a statement, okay? Can I perhaps just take advantage of the fact that I'm sitting here, Kim, and just ask you as an icebreaker. shifts in public spending on the scale that you're talking about, it's huge scale, surely would require equally huge shifts in public opinion. And so I'm wondering how you'd propose that that would be achieved without scaring the bejesus out of everybody. I mean, shifts in public opinion on the scale that would be warranted by a real existential threat on the scale of the World War II analogy that you referred to. So can you talk about that a bit?
Well, since I have the bejesus scared out of me, why shouldn't everybody else? That's a...
Make us all pessimists.
Look, I think you just got to keep explaining. You've got good exponents. You've got bipartisan support. You've got all the elements, the essential elements of changing things. They've just got to get on with it.
Well, so I'm sure there's a lot of people who'd like to ask questions. Do we have a mic roving around? So why don't we start on just near the door there?
Georgina Carnegie. Kim, national planning. We had the last time Australia attempted national planning was in the early 60s, and Menzies threw it in the wastebucket, and hasn't been attempted since. But if you're talking about sectors of the economy, how do you bring public opinion with you unless you bring together a framework of thinking that doesn't take it sector by sector on a vertical scale, but starts to make the public aware of the decision making that we will require, particularly if we take Xi seriously, and he's got 5 years before he's comes up for reappointment, and he's determined to make a mark, and he has a good chance, given all the negativeness of China and the excess of relative young men, the benefits for him of taking early strike action against Taiwan are great. So, two topics probably entwined, the national planning to bring awareness to the public and China's potential for action within a 5-year period.
I'll take the second first, which is the question of China and the possibility of an engagement on Taiwan. Look, everybody says it's high. I don't know as much about China as many other people I know, and so I'm always cautious about making pronouncements about the directions in which they might go. We have Kevin Rudd's views on all of this, and that's about all you need. And I think but the thing is this, the Taiwanese have been poor in the way in which they've organised their defence. Their defence has been organised around frightening the American administration with the China lobby to send them second-hand destroyers, second-hand F-16s. They're the most brilliant people on earth, the Taiwanese, and they should have been building bevies of ballistic missiles, bevies of mines and land-based torpedoes and all of that sort of stuff, which they are now starting to do. Now, of course, when you start a build-up, that is often your most dangerous point. So the Chinese are now aware that the Taiwanese are starting a truly massive build-up in relation to turning themselves into a porcupine. And so that puts a piece of pressure on Xi. Xi has had to take a look at what's happened to Russia and understand that his armed forces are based really on Russian kit or variants of Russian kit that and he now needs to ask himself the question, do we have the same problems that they do? And because their weapons don't work. And the only time it works is when you're doing a World War II pounding of dumb artillery on the lines that you're attacking. So that's a question that he has to bear in mind. He also has to bear in mind a question on the economy. Now, I don't think that China can in any shape or form be isolated like Russia, and Russia's darn hard, as the Europeans have learned themselves with what's happening with the price of petrol and gas and the rest of it, as Russia gets cut out of the system. But it's a pretty fair lesson, and it requires a lot of pondering, because Xi can stay in power without Taiwan. Provided there is that coverage of ambiguity, that view that there is, that we're not here. We're not here to try and disprove his claims on Taiwan. There are people here who do argue that. But prudence by both the previous government and this government has suggested you don't wander around doing things like that, making the Chinese upset and concerned for what the rest of the world might think about Taiwan. So this may be handleable diplomatically, and then the consequences of a lot of the other things I was talking about, if they are indeed happening, and like I said, I'm no Chinese monkey on this stuff, but I just go on what other people who are expert in that area talk about when it comes to demographics. That's that. Now on planning. I just settle for defence planning and everything related to our defence. Now it's not just, of course, the defence budget itself, but I would not permit a road to be built anywhere in the north that doesn't have a disguised landing field incorporated within it. I would ensure that every port that we have is Navy capable. We can't operate our submarines from Stirling. It's not the right place for it. It is the right place for it industrially, but it's not the right place for it warfighting. And the Australians found that in World War II. Yes, quite a few of the submarines operated from Fremantle, but many operated from Albany and from Exmouth Gulf. And Albany has Australia's best harbour. It is very deep, very quickly, with multiple exits. And even though it's a greater distance, a lot of American submarines operated from there, and the only war memorial to the massive American submarine effort from Australia, such as Brisbane as well in the east, is in Albany, nowhere else. And it's the most appropriate place for it. And then you've got Exmouth Gulf. Yes, we need to build a submarine base there or make it submarine base capable. And Navy more generally around the coast. And then with the Army, we need to ensure that really right across the north, there is a capacity in the civilian sector to sustain the activity of Army, which may mean a lot of the roads need to be reinforced from where they are now. It's that sort of planning. If you try to be more ambitious, public won't take it. They might take that.
Great, thank you. There's a lady just in the front row here, Jack. Karen.
Thanks, Simon. Karen Cooman. Thank you, Kim, for that fabulous traverse of 75 years of history. What I wanted to ask is about how we navigate forward both from a defence point of view and a domestic point of view in relation to the Chinese. So if you go back about 12 years, and I happen to be just looking through my cabinet of interesting reports and found the Asian Century report from about 12 years ago, which was great excitement about the opportunities of China, and things have changed greatly since then. Yeah. And we need to reevaluate how we engage and how we protect ourselves. But at the same time, we have, a very rich multicultural society here with many prominent and, fabulous Chinese origin citizens. So how do we navigate this increasing fear and need to focus on how we keep ourselves secure over the next decade and beyond, with keeping the very thing that we value the most, which is our functioning multicultural democracy, and the Chinese people people from Chinese origins that live here also feel they've got a role to play, because that you know, we've seen many times in history how it's easier to jump back into a xenophobic approach to anyone who's different, and that would destroy the very thing that we are trying to protect. So I just wondered if you had some comments on how to balance that.
Well, Chinese Australians are fine. They're patriotic Australians. They're terrific people. The second biggest language spoken at home is Mandarin here in Australia. They're fine people. And politicians need to make that clear. We have intelligence services, and if people are turning on us for any reason, they ought to be able to detect it. And my impression of the Chinese, if they get the view that somebody they know is a problem, they tell us. So I'm not in the least bit worried about Chinese Australians. I don't like talking about Chinese Australians. I don't like talking about Italo-Australians. I don't like talking about Greek Australians. That's very American. I just prefer to talk about Australians. If somebody wants to take a comparison a point further, well, up to them, but I don't. And so I don't worry about Chinese Australians. I don't even use the expression except when you're talking in circumstances like this. So they're an enormous benefit to us, really enormous. And we need to understand that because they need to, like all Australians, they are entitled to comfort and to a sense of their citizenship. And the fact that they are part of a great multicultural society which now takes as its identity, its multicultural character. So I don't worry, I don't lose any sleep over those Australians who are of Chinese origin. I know they're fine, and if I know individuals are not, that ASIO is well equipped to handle it.
Erica, there's a lot of hands up at the back there. So, gentleman in the pink shirt.
Good, thank you. Dr. Carl Mullis, recovering academic.
Me too.
So you're frightened, that's fantastic. I'd like to be more frightened. I'm not clear on exactly what the scenario is that you're frightened of. There seems to be a mix there of our ability to project force to North Asia and the ability to defend from massive land-based invasion into Australia. And they're quite different scenarios.
Yes.
You'd need to have your
yes, they are.
completely structured differently. So one, what is this scenario? Two, the historical ability of Australia to ramp up production World War II, the technology involved in weaponry has, of course, evolved massively. You
Correct.
can't ramp up constructing those sort of things. And to channel a former Defence Minister who said in respect of the Australian Submarine Corps that he wouldn't trust them to build a canoe, our track record on building these sorts of things here is not strong, I would suggest. So how do we actually succeed in building up this capability given the population and capabilities that we've got here?
Good question. And yes, of course, what you say is correct. We could never do an Essington Lewis performance again. That's just not on the cards. We ramped up massive defence production. It was capable of sustaining MacArthur. He got most of his stuff from us, not from the US in World War II. Can't do that. You're quite right. But we can do more. We are actually very inventive. And you find, particularly associated with the mining industry, a whole bunch of technologies that will be very useful. There's an outfit called Blue Ocean in Blue Ocean monitoring in Western Australia. I just cite this as an example because there's stacks of these in the east. But I just cite this one. They have invented a thing called an underwater glider, which can go over thousands of miles and on its batteries. And this glider they use extensively in the mining industry in WA to keep a check on offshore rigs, which there are lots. in West Australia, but also to do environmental studies. Now you could put hydroponic stuff on that if you wanted to. And if you did, you could throw out SOSIS arrays anywhere that you want them in the oceans to our north. And that'd pick up submarines going through anywhere. You can do that with them. You can also put on them the capability to guy a submarine. So instead of seeing one Australian submarine, the enemy would see 100. And you can attach mines to them and you can surge them in thousands. So there are these sorts of things all over the country. And the question is, how many of them do you weaponise? How many of them do you take forward? And these things will be looked at. I know they're being looked at by the committee that's taking a look at them. It's all expensive. That's the truth. So I'm less worried about whether or not we can do the things we ought to be able to do than I am about us affording to do the things that we ought to do. What you say about, and this is what I mentioned at the beginning of it, it was a surprise for me that the government defined the way in which we look at our front line, because that's not how I used to look at it. I used to look at it in the context of the area of direct military interest. This is way into what we used to describe as the area of strategic interest. But it is a not unreasonable philosophy to try and hold a would-be enemy at that length. What are the scenarios? Well, I don't speculate on scenarios, I speculate on capabilities. That's why it was very important for me to do that in the 1980s. I never once mentioned the word Indonesia, for example, in the structure of the armed forces that we were planning. I talked about what are the capabilities in the region to do what to us. And that's a question. I don't like constantly naming the Chinese, but that is the question is, what are the capabilities that exist in this region, which if they happen to be used against us would create what problem? And there's no question that there are capabilities in the region that can create the problems that I've been talking about. No question that exists. So the question is then intentions. So intentions can change tomorrow. Capabilities take years. I'm not sure any longer that we have years. I think we're going to have to think with the seat of our pants if anything happens in the next 3 or 4. But we do want to avoid, if at all possible, via diplomacy, those intentions changing, and that is actually very important in relation to Taiwan. And because that's not something that you'd want to see happen for the sake of the Taiwanese people, even if they could resist. Because what would happen to our economy and the global economy would be nobody's business in circumstances like that if they emerged.
So I think we probably only have time for one more. But
I can be here forever, mate. I'm enjoying this.
Those who still have questions can perhaps corner Mr. Beazley when we have drinks outside afterwards. So one more. Gentleman with the blue shirt, just behind the one with the pink shirt.
Thank you, Kim. Professor Stephen Bartos. I write regularly on defence issues, and we have a mutual history as well. I'm glad you mentioned Indonesia, because that was the one country in what I thought was a terrific speech you hadn't mentioned to date. I'm more of an optimist than you are. I think the chances of any sort of Chinese incursion into Australia are very minimal. But should that happen, the chances of the Chinese succeeding, if Indonesia is on China's side, are almost 100%. If Indonesia is on Australia's side, it's more of a line ball. So it seems to me, and this is a view shared by our mutual colleague Hugh White, that really the strategic priority for Australia is to get in good with the Indonesians and to build a really strong cooperative relationship in relation to strategic and military affairs with Indonesia. Would you agree with that perspective?
Yeah, I would, but and I have to be said, I wasn't a help. Keating made me come to sign with him that treaty of cooperation with the Indonesians, because I think he knew how much they didn't like me. And he also knew how much, and there's no reason for them not to like me, but nevertheless they did have a problem with me. I remember before we did the 87 white paper, going up and seeing my counterpart Benny Madani to brief him on its content. And I said, even though we're shifting everything north and we're developing all these capabilities, it's not aimed at you. But what we understand is that any enemy has to come through you to get to us. It's happened before. And I used to say to him, you think that we don't like you and that we're always complaining about you, but the simple fact of the matter, on you and this government hangs our survival. You are the people who actually keep these 17,000 islands in one piece. If you were to fall apart on that basis, we really would have a defence problem on our hands of potentially quite massive proportions. He used to say to me too, because in those days the Indonesian cabinet apparently talked about us with less friendliness than they have of many recent years. But Benny used to say to me, you know, this is called deterrence. He said, whenever my cabinet colleagues get a bit stroppy, he didn't use that expression, stroppy with Australia and say that we need to make Australia pay for this or that, I always remind them, the Australians have a bomber that can put a bomb through that window onto this table. Now, do you really want to go ahead, given that the Australians have that, and do anything like what it is that you're talking about? That was useful. He also, in the first 4 session with me, he said, I want to know the exact state of your guarantees to Papua New Guinea. It was a 4 session in which I said to him, you know, we would fight for Papua New Guinea to the last Australian soldier, and if you don't believe me, ring the Japanese. And however, you also need to know we'd never tell them that. Just as likely to test it out as anything else. He said, well, if that's your view, will you kindly do something about the fact that across the border continually come people who are fighting a guerrilla warfare against us, and put them under some form of restraint? I said, okay, you know, we will talk about that. And I went and when I saw Michael Samari about it, I said, mate, you've got to patrol your border, you've got to keep it in order. And he said, well, why don't you put a battalion in there yourselves? To which my response was, we don't do that anymore. That's not something that we would do. And he said, well, if you don't, there's no road systems, it's impossible for us. So I said, all right, what if I gave you a couple of helicopters? Oh yes, that'd be a good idea. So you can use those helicopters to patrol the border. Why? It's a good idea. We gave them a couple of helicopters, and the next time I saw them, they were up there in Bougainville with an M60 hanging out the door, dealing with people in Bougainville, and I just remember saying, that's not where they're meant to be. But they did, you know, they had a serious problem, the Indonesians. I don't think they have that problem to the same extent at all now. But keeping the Indonesians happy was very important for us. And it was no less important by the fact that they protected us, even if they didn't want to and they weren't aware of it. So yes, the Indonesians are important, but that doesn't stop us, or should not stop us, whether our neighbours were allies, friends or enemies, from planning a force structure that could deal with capabilities that could be turned against us.
I'm actually sensing you'd be okay with one more question.
I'd be okay with 20 more. There might be people here who have a different view about how they want to spend the rest of the evening.
Thanks.
Jim Sternhell here. My question is, who sold Australia out in terms of allowing our underlying industries to be undermined? The selling off of the rare earth, mines to China who just plunder it, and we probably get hardly any royalties, and allowing our refining capacity to go to pretty well zero?
Look, I think the thing that the Kool-Aid that we've drunk, and for other purposes, it's a good ale to sip on, and that is we've made ourselves in many ways quite globally competitive in many areas, and the changes that have been put in place in the way the economy's been managed over the years. We're a very successful nation economically. And so, I mean, the trouble is the economists, the businessmen, the people who work in the factories and the rest of it, they're just ordinary, decent people who look optimistically at the world. So, I mean, governments respond to what people want. Contrary to what people suspect, governments try not to impose on them. Governments try to do things that make them happy and spend on things that make them happy. So I can't blame anyone for any of that, really. You know, you can't... Most governments in this country have governed in accordance with the wishes of the people. And you can't abolish the people and elect a new one. We are democracies, and democracies produce their governments. The countries which are not democracies, you see how the people try to create space for themselves, like the Chinese now, the Ukrainians, no chance. So I don't go around looking to blame people. I just go around trying to find what we do now. And what we do now is we're going to have to do some uneconomic things if we're going to survive. And now the uneconomic things are quite easy to do in defence industries. People accept that. Whether we get the Americans and the British to do it on rare earths is entirely a different matter. Because the way they're talking at the moment, they haven't got a clue about what it is that will need to be done. Because what it is that needs to be done is just way more than is being done at the moment. And we have to convince them. It's not up to anyone else, because we have everything that's needed and we have the skills.
One more.
Yeah.
We'll make this the last one.
Yeah, if you like, there's a bloke down the back, though, that's all, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beazley. My name's Aidan. I'm from the University of Queensland. My question was, Malcolm Turnbull came to the University of Queensland last week and he spoke about a number of things, but one thing he mentioned was AUKUS. And he said that AUKUS was probably the biggest mistake that the Morrison government made. That was his view. I was wondering if you could go more into your view of the AUKUS alliance, if you like.
It's not an alliance, mate. I mean, this is the thing. People don't actually understand what AUKUS is. AUKUS is not the American alliance, period. Nor is it an alliance with Britain. We do have an alliance with Britain. It's called the Five-Power Defence Arrangement. It's right at the heart of the most important strategic area of Southeast Asia. And we have a military alliance with the British and with the Malaysians and Singaporeans, consequent upon that. So we have military alliances with the Americans and the British. They don't need any reason like AUKUS to be around here. I think one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic about our ability to get something going on rare earths,
I'm glad you're optimistic about it.
is AUKUS. AUKUS. Because just the US and the UK, you can monster them. So we are in a position to give them a really good monstering. There's lots of people talking to us about rare earths. The Germans are talking to us. The French are talking to us. The Americans are talking to us. The Japanese, big time, talking to us. The South Koreans are now talking to us. Lots of people are talking to us. But they're not the people that we can sit, with the possible exception of the Japanese, that we can sit down and talk through what needs to be done, because they all want to make money. They think there's money in rare earths. Well, this phone works so well because there's slightly less than a gram of rare earths in it. The entire world production of market of rare earths each year is 60 billion. 70 billion in iron ore goes out of Western Australia into China. That gives you a bit of an idea about how minuscule the rare earth industry is. You cannot make it work if you're going to work it commercially. I think we've got a better chance of talking the Brits and the Americans into doing things that are not commercial than we have of talking the Germans, the French, maybe the Japanese. I might take that out. Not the Koreans, couldn't do that. It's just a group that you can talk to. And when you have a big problem, it's a good group to talk to. Most of the technologies that we are looking at under AUKUS, we're looking at under the American relationship anyway. But this sort of speeds them up, speeds up the process, and probably gives us a bit of a market where things can be done commercially with the Americans and the Brits. That's no bad thing. So I don't look at AUKUS as anything other than a group of people talking about developing what are very important capabilities with the best capacity to communicate with each other for over years of practice on them. So I think Malcolm's quite wrong.
Was there one more right up the back? The hand up just there.
Tim Mitchell. Thank you, Kim, for your terrific insights. You mentioned allies in the Pacific. If there was a Taiwan conflict, could you just dig into the weeds a little bit into who would do what, like your Japans, your Philippines, Indonesia, Korea, etc., in terms of such a conflict, and what level of reliance the US could give to those?
I know quite a bit of what we'd do, but this is being broadcast. and therefore I'm not going to indulge in a discussion about where all those things might lead us. But can I say we would be in a very difficult situation if there was an attack, particularly an unprovoked attack on Taiwan by China. We would be in very difficult circumstances and we would be engaged. So how all that would play out, I think I know, but I don't want to say. It's just too troubling, tendentious.
I'm going to invite one of our Ramsay board members, Ms. Elizabeth Stone, the principal of Queenwood College and recently appointed head of Winchester College in the UK, to give the vote of thanks.
Congratulations. Fantastic.
Well, that really was something of a tour de force. We got breadth, we got geopolitics and international relations and security issues, touch of theology at one point. We got height, we got the bird's eye view on the large movements of history and international relations. We got depth, submarine choke points, energy policy, rare earths, right down to the number of warships in a never implemented defence strategy of 17 years ago. It really was, I think, a tremendous demonstration of the extraordinary richness, Mr. Beazley, that you have brought from your many years of experience in government and politics, and not least the great admiration that you earned in your tenure as Defence Minister in that notoriously, fiendishly difficult portfolio. So to have all of that served up to us, I have to tell you a story. My very first board meeting as a director of the Ramsay Centre was when you were still on the board. And we finished the meeting and we cracked open a tray of sandwiches, and you and Mr. Howard started just shooting the breeze on this kind of stuff. And so you both sat there with sort of, I don't know, a chicken wrap in your hand, and I metaphorically got out the popcorn and just sat back to listen and learn. And I had something of that same feeling this evening as we were listening to you. I really do think we are just so lucky, particularly now. I understand, obviously, appointed as Governor of Western Australia, there are quite tightly circumscribed bounds of proper comment. But now that term has that distinguished term has expired, how wonderful for us in Australia to have your re-entry into this kind of discussion. We need your knowledge, we need your wisdom, we need quite literally, apparently, a call to arms. So thank you so much on behalf of everyone here for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much. Many thanks. That's terrific. Thank you.